Okay, so welcome to Transform Gov, the digital government podcast with me, Maeve Neefsey. So in each episode, we're exploring innovations and challenges and success stories that are shaping digital transformation within the public sector. And we're always excited to hear and learn from people who've been there or done that before, and also those who are leading the way. And today's guest is part 2 of John Barron from the Revenue Commissioners, who's the CIO there, who is one of those people. And we're really thrilled to have him for part 2. But I must remind you that Transform Gov is part of the Ireland eGovernment Awards, which will be opening for entries again this year, not 2025, and is brought to you in association with Accenture. So, John, Revenue Commissioners, part 2, fascinating interview part 1. I'll just tell people what they're missing to make sure that they don't forget to listen. So we talked about why democracy needs a really strong revenue infrastructure, and I think you'll find that really interesting. We talk about the introduction of self-assessment, and compliance, and people's desire to be able to do an awful lot of business with revenue online and how well that's been rolled out. Then we talk about some of the abilities to kind of select technologies and how you pick your frameworks and how revenue has evolved because it's been 60 years using technology. And then we also talk about the use of data to spot kind of anomalies and to allow revenue to do a better job in seeing where there may be people who aren't complying.
Correct.
So it's fascinating, and I think it's well worth listening to for everybody. So please don't miss it. So we also know that revenue are trailblazers, and we still haven't got to the bottom of why they are. That's my view anyway. We know that it's because there's an appetite and a determination, but I think there are probably people in there as well. Do you think that we had specially good people in revenue when it was kind of beginning to use technology?
I think we've been very lucky. We have very forward-thinking people. We've very bright people. And we've people who want to do the best possible job and take the job of tax collection and indeed customs really seriously. And they see the benefit of technology. So I'm very lucky in that, I'm not an IT guy saying you should do this to my business colleagues. My business colleagues are coming to me saying, we really need you to help us. So it's very collaborative, and we work together on coming up with ideas and solutions and how we might apply technology to certain problems. Like at the moment, the economy is growing, economy is doing very well, and that's putting pressure back on revenue. Like the number of taxpayers has increased.
Yeah, of course.
The number of revenue officials hasn't increased.
Yeah.
So how do you make up the difference? So you make up the difference typically using technology. And we use technology as judiciously as we can to, enable the organisation. So I think it's a very collaborative, forward-thinking, open-minded as well, and actually, being determined to do a good job for revenue and for the country, and using all of the tools that we possibly can to do that, and that includes technology. So it'd be very much up there, and we see ourselves as, an organisation that cannot really function without our technology. So that's how embedded it is. And as such, it gets great support from senior management and from colleagues across the organisation. It puts huge demands on us on the IT side because we've probably more demand than we definitely have more demand than we can satisfy.
Yeah.
And that comes down to prioritisation and the business working with us to actually help us prioritise and decide what we need to do. Increasingly, a lot of what we need to do is mandated. It's legislatively bound, and that's obviously the way of it. But that sometimes can be frustrating because there's other things we want to do, and we can't quite get to them yet because we haven't got capacity.
And in terms of people, how many people work with you, John?
On the IT side, I have, and it's a big number, I have just over 300 revenue staff.
Okay.
But I also have about 300 externals.
Okay.
So it's a big
team. And you need
team.
that flexibility, I'm guessing.
Yeah, no, you have to remember as well, we're 24/7. So included in that is a whole shift arrangement. We've operations. We also have big printing and mailing setup, which would fall under my remit as well, for getting out the demands. Although increasingly they're electronic, but there's still an amount of paper generated as well. So yeah, it's a big part of the organisation.
And before we broke, as part one, we talked about policy. So policy comes along and you have to implement it, like the pension system, now that we have to change. How do you work when you get a policy in like that? how do you just approach it and say, okay, how are we going to introduce this?
I suppose revenue implement the policy. We don't actually
No, of course, you don't
write
write the policy. Yeah.
We do have, we have a legislative arm, and they would feed into to Department of Finance in particular. But when we get a policy, and you mentioned pensions is actually a social welfare initiative, the auto-enrollment pensions that's coming up. And they approached us to see could we support them in developing it, because they want to kind of piggyback it on top of PAYE, because it's going to be payroll based.
Yeah.
That makes perfect sense, joined up government. So we're working with our colleagues in DSP at the moment to enable that. But I suppose in terms of implementing policy, we work with our business colleagues, our tax experts, if you like, or our customs experts, to get down, I suppose, to map the policy down to
the granular detail.
The real requirements, and then you turn them into specs for systems, and it's all that usual stuff takes place then. We're moving increasingly towards agile development. We would have traditionally been waterfall. Given the types of systems we build, that still suits for lots of stuff. But we're increasingly agile. But, we don't have a lot of flex, because if the legislation says the system must do X, you can't put that in your backlog. So it still has to do X.
Yeah.
But, in terms of ways of working, we're looking at can we be more agile? And I suppose the proof of the pudding on that one came in COVID. I'd mentioned Brexit in the earlier session, because that happened in COVID time. But the big thing that came out of COVID was we were able to turn the PAYE system that we just released the previous year, 2019, and 2020 we turned it upside down.
Okay.
Effectively, we turned it upside down, and instead of taking in money,
you're giving out money.
We were giving out money, and we were paying out money to employers so that employers could keep staff on their books, and we were paying the wage subsidy schemes through payroll to employers. And that was really important for the country.
Yeah.
Obviously really important for people to pay their bills and all that sort of stuff. And keep everything going. Really important for employers, so that when the COVID lockdowns finished, they still had a workforce, and the workforce were able to go back to work. And
was that
really
done
important.
Under huge pressure, time
Absolutely.
pressure? Tell us about that. I mean, I think it must have been. I've talked to so many people now in the podcast in Transform Gov about the COVID impact. But what amazes me is the speed in which you could turn things around. How did you make that happen?
I got a phone call on a Saturday morning from the chairman, and he said, "Look, we need to do something. Country's gone into lockdown. We need to be able to support something. Can you have a think?" So myself and one of my development managers at the time, Ruth, we got in touch with each other, and we had a think. And she was working on the PAYE system at the time, and she came up with a couple of ideas. We bounced them around, and we said, "Yeah, we can do this." So basically, we asked employers to apply a certain mark on the inbound files, basically a PRSI field that wasn't being used. And on foot of that being marked, we knew it was one of the cases that needed. Remember, some businesses were still running during COVID.
Yeah.
But we knew if the business filled that in, we were able to say, well, okay, now we pay out. And then there were various thresholds based on previous pay that people are determined what people were getting. So it was different to the PUP, which DSP administered. So we were doing it to employers, and then the employers were paying the employees. It was quite pressured. I think we paid out the first money within, I think it was 10 days of the lockdown. Or certainly about a week.
Wow,
it wasn't
that's fast.
Yeah.
I mean, did you learn things from that?
And no, it was very rough and ready.
Okay, I think
but
nobody
then
would
we
expect it
evolved
to be
that
perfect.
into what was called the temporary wage subsidy scheme, and that ran for approximately a year, and then it evolved into the employer wage subsidy scheme, which was a much better, more robust system. The temporary wage subsidy scheme was, because of the nature of it, had to be turned around really quickly, was quite rough and ready, and there were shortcomings in it, and we tightened them up in the employer wage subsidy scheme. And that ran till the end of COVID, and paid out whatever number of billions, I think it was 7 billion euros or something, to 600,000 employers.
We almost forget it, don't you? It's weird, but I mean, it was such a massive
it was huge, huge.
And in terms of what experiences did you learn from it? Because for example, when I was talking to some of the team from the HSE who are working in collaboration like you were with lots of departments, there was a lot of agility that was going on.
Oh, yeah. From home.
From home. Exactly. Again, we
from
forget
home,
that, from home.
Which was new. We were very fortunate. We were able to switch to home working literally overnight because we did thin client environment, and we were able to just tell people to
So for
sign
people
in
who
from
don't
home.
know what thin client environment is, maybe you might just give us a
So
quick brief.
thin client environment is well, we were using Citrix is the technology. So basically, you don't have a PC, you don't have, you don't really have you have a small little operating system on the device. It boots into the Citrix environment, which is actually hosted in our data center. So the data actually never leaves Revenue. So all you're getting is screen and keyboard traffic to your laptop or your thin client device.
So very easy to quickly become remote, basically.
Absolutely, yeah. And using two-factor authentication then to get into it, yeah. So
how many people had to go home?
Approximately, Revenue have a staff of about 7,000 at the moment.
Okay.
So at the time, it was probably a little bit less than that, maybe 6,500. Customs officers still had to turn up for work.
Of course,
Ports and airports were still, and in fact, the customs people played a really important role in facilitating, the arrival of medical equipment and all that sort of stuff, and fast tracking that through customs channels. So that was a really important job they were doing. And then we had about 4,500 to 5,000 people working remotely.
And did you not have to have a support backup for them?
Well, we still have operations. We still had all of our IT people on call. Obviously, it was funny during COVID. I think people were very much willing to wear their green jersey, and people worked long hours. They worked odd hours to support things, and it was a great testament to people's commitment.
Yeah.
And it was really that, we wanted to do the best for Ireland. I think everybody across the country, be they shopkeepers or bus drivers or medical staff, were all putting their back to the wheel, and certainly we saw that in Revenue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then did you take things from that? You said, okay, we learned that during COVID. We're going to apply that to how we work, or were there
well, as I
things coming
mentioned,
out of that?
we're moving more, we moved, as part of COVID, we moved more into things like agile. I think other things that certainly proved themselves a lot more in the pandemic certainly was cloud. It kind of reinforced, or maybe in some ways changed my view, because I was always a bit nervous of cloud. The cloud really came to the fore, I think, out of COVID. And I think that's now part of our ICT direction. We move more towards cloud rather than having everything on premise. And that's important for all sorts of reasons. So, there are lessons that came out and changes that have come out of COVID. Working from home is still...
Has that worked?
Still there, yeah.
I mean, do you think in the long term it's just...
We collected 108 billion euros last year.
Yeah.
That was just released yesterday. So is tax still functioning even though people are working remotely? Yes. It'll take a while to bed down and still in a bedding down phase. But I think it works very well. It gives us an opportunity as well to access resources and capabilities outside of Dublin.
Yeah.
And
not
now
ask
Revenue
people to travel.
Revenue was always a countrywide organisation. We have tax offices in most counties. But it gives us the opportunity, say on the IT side, to tap into IT resources that don't live in Dublin and maybe can't now afford to live in Dublin.
Yes.
So that's been a benefit. And we want to be a good place to work. I have an IT team in Castlebar, I have an IT team in Limerick, and I have an IT team in Dublin, where, when I started as CIO 10 years ago, it was just Dublin.
Right. It just wasn't possible.
Well, it wasn't possible. It wasn't even thought about.
Yeah.
But I think it's opened up all those possibilities for us, and it gives us access, not just on the IT side, indeed, on accountancy people and people that we want to work in tax. It gives us access to people outside of Dublin. So I think that's been a big benefit that's come out.
Yeah, absolutely, for lots of different departments. In terms of AI, I mean, I know it's not new to you guys.
No.
So you've been using it for a while. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, we won an award, actually. It wasn't the e-government award.
Well, don't bother mentioning that.
We won an award in 2018 for our first kind of foray into AI, which was basically a virtual assistant. So it was using NLP. And we won that. I can't remember. It's a London event. Funny name. But we've been looking at AI, obviously, over the last 2 years in particular. Gen AI has really kicked off, but we were actually looking at it prior to that for things like natural language processing. But we have a whole AI kind of a approach strategy now in terms of how we're going to look at it. We have released some applications live in AI, are using AI. They form part of broader solutions. They're part of a solution. And we see great potential in it. But it's not going to replace everything.
Well, look, before we get into that, I have to take a pause to thank our fantastic partners, Accenture.
Through the power of cloud, data and AI, Accenture is helping the public sector by blending human ingenuity, technology and a delivery-focused culture to turn their ambitions into action. Be ready for any challenge by adopting a continuous reinvention mindset to deliver human-centric services that adapt and grow with your needs. Contact the team at Accenture to find out more.
So we're back now, and after our little break, and John and I were just beginning to start talking about AI, that it's not new to Revenue, but have you got particular projects now that you're kind of getting excited about, that you're piloting in terms of using AI?
We actually have one live on the public-facing website. It's for PAYE customers who maybe want to raise an inquiry with us. And what we've done is we've used the power of AI and NLP to actually allow the taxpayer to type in what it is they're querying about. And it will interpret that and direct the question or the query to the right area of revenue. Where previously they would have had to go through a series of drop-downs, and like the drop-downs were 20 items long, followed by a drop-off of another 20 and a drop-off. And that was all about routing it to the right place. The AI now enables that to be routed directly to the right part of revenue so you can get a speedier response. It's got an accuracy of about 98-point-something%.
Wow, okay. To get to the right people in the organisation.
The prior system, which was kind of a manual user-selected system, was about 70%.
And would you look at using it to actually answer the questions rather than direct it to the person who can answer the question?
We've also released internally a system called RevAssist, which uses a large language model on the Amazon platform. And it is pointed or trained on our tax and duty manuals. So they're basically the manuals that Revenue use to administer the tax. And it's all the how-to, what-ifs, this is what you do.
Any lessons learned that you could share with your colleagues?
Well, we've released that for internal staff. It had to go through a level of training. It's sandboxed. It's only available internally. But the results out of that are proving very good. We want to let it bed down a little bit more. And what we'd be looking at doing in the longer term then is using that to actually front an FAQ type system for taxpayers so they can query our website. And even in time, you could say, well, let's link it in with an LLP. So you could do it on the phone. So the person can say, well, how do I claim rent credit relief? And very simple
they're
example.
Talking to AI.
And they're talking to an AI. Would say, well, you can do this, that, and the other. This is what the tax and duty manual says. And that's where we'd like to go with that. So I think there are huge potentials there. We have to accept it won't always be right, but it will be probably more correct.
Well, particularly when you've got resource and budget limitations.
It'll probably be more correct. And the more we train it, the better it'll become. So we want to train it internally first before we look at releasing that piece out into the public domain. But as I say, we do have a piece out there already in the public domain. And we've a couple of other pieces on the go. We want to look as well at using maybe some of the powers of AI to help us interpret our own data. And use that internally and then feed it into other systems.
And is that in terms of interpreting data, or what are you thinking?
Well, it's more about maybe going back to non-compliance, looking at can we use it. Now, obviously, with the EU AI Act, we have to be very cognizant of the requirements around that. So anything it would feed out would have to go to humanise.
Absolutely.
So that's what we want to look at next. Maybe looking in that space, are there things we can do to identify anomalies? Because it's good at identifying anomalies.
Exactly.
And you can look at an anomaly and it might be fine. When somebody actually looks and says, that's okay.
It's not a rule, it's just an anomaly.
Exactly,
Right.
Yeah.
And just in terms of your priorities now, well, firstly, before we get into that, is there any country in terms of the revenue element of that country that are using AI in a way that you think is advanced?
Not that we've seen. And we have, one of my team is on an EU working group looking at the implementation of AI across the community. And there's nothing that he's seen that, we're not already looking at. In fact, most of the countries are looking to us to say, what have you guys done?
Well, do you actually facilitate a lot of helping of other countries?
Oh, yeah, we're on various committees and we would have a lot of interaction with neighbouring tax administrations across Europe and obviously the UK and the US, the OECD. We're in the OECD. I mean, I was in a CIO meeting earlier this year of OECD CIOs, and we would share ideas and exchange thoughts and that sort of thing. So it's good in terms of getting a view on where we are. Are we on the right track? Are we way off? Are we way ahead? We tend to be towards the leading edge. I think, as I mentioned to you when we were talking previously, like Ireland punches above its weight in lots of things, and Ireland punches above its weight in terms of tax administration. We're certainly in the Premier League.
That's good to know.
And we would be vying for a Champions League spot most years. Okay. So, we're not at the top.
Yeah.
There's other countries that are probably
Who's
up
at the
there.
top, do you think?
You've got countries like Singapore would be very advanced. Australia are very good. Canada. We're up there.
Good.
We're up there.
And just in terms of, what your priorities are, what are you working on now? That is in terms of projects that are...
So the next big project for revenue is what we're calling VAT modernisation. So VAT, huge tax, takes in lots of money, and we're looking at modernising that fundamentally. Now it ties in with some requirements that are coming out of the EU. So the EU are very concerned about cross-border trade and VAT and cross-border trade. And there's a thing called...
Carousel, is it?
VAT carousel fraud.
VAT carousel, yeah. Which is a fantastic word.
Yeah, so this is to do with, the sale of goods across the community. So if somebody in Ireland sells goods into France, they sell it VAT-free, and then the French company that buy it are supposed to declare the VAT in France.
Okay,
and so what VIDA is about, or VAT in the digital age, is about having a mechanism where those transactions are tracked at a transaction level. So basically invoice level. Now, if you're going to introduce that for cross-community sales, realistically, you have to kind of introduce it for domestic sales as well, because companies don't have two invoicing systems. So we're looking at that at the moment. There's a bit of heavy thinking going on, how we would do this, how we minimise, obviously, compliance costs, how we maximise the benefits for businesses and ourselves. And there could be big benefits here for business in terms of B2B invoicing, e-invoicing. And it's not sending somebody a PDF. E-invoicing systems is a standard, an EU standard called PEPL is one of the standards. This is system-to-system stuff.
Okay.
So my company invoice your company electronically, your company receive the invoice in your payment system. It says, we can link that with our invoice or our receipt of goods, and we make the payment to my company's bank account.
Okay.
And you don't actually need a whole lot of invoice processing going on. So there are huge benefits for business as well if this is done correctly. And then, if you like, one of the byproducts of that, in the same way that we implemented PAYE, is we could get a view of that transaction. And then once we get a view of that transaction, we would then be able to look at companies in terms of turnover and VAT returns. Can we automate all of that and maybe take some of the pain out of it? So that's going to be a big project. There's lots more happening on the customs side. Obviously, we mentioned auto enrollment, working with DSP. That'll be a big project, I think. Now, much more so for DSP than for ourselves. And then there's ongoing things that we have to do, PAYE, income tax updates. Another big one, and it's important to mention this, is there's a whole host of change coming in for large multinationals now. It's called Pillar 2. It's corporation tax. So it's this 15% standard rate for companies with turnover of 750 million or more.
Okay.
And a lot of them have their European headquarters in Ireland.
Yes, we know. We're happy about that.
It's a big issue for we have to build a system to support that, and that involve data exchanges with other countries. Obviously, potentially more tax being gathered from these companies. So we're working through that at the moment. That's a complex one as well for the near future.
If you're looking down the track, talk about the near future in 5 years, what do you think? What are the main changes you think we're going to see around the use of technology within organisations like Revenue?
I think the next 5 years, like one thing that we haven't spoken about, and I think it affects lots of organisations in the public sector in particular, is technology debt. And people build systems and they work grand. And then they work and they work. But 10 years later now, that technology is aged. You have to look at replacing it. that becomes risky, becomes costly. Maybe the experts who helped build that system back then aren't available now.
Yeah.
So I think technology debt is going to have to be addressed. It's a big issue. I think we are addressing it actively. We have an active program of technical modernisation ongoing at the moment. So that's going to be a big ticket item for us at the technology side over the next few years.
It's just ongoing anyway. Why particularly now?
It's bigger than that. You should be doing a level of upgrading all the time anyway. But I think you get to a stage where, for example, we've had to move from our Solaris kit to Linux.
Okay.
Because Solaris was effectively end of life.
Yeah, so it's not supported
by Oracle, because they took it over. So 2034, I think, was the target date. Now, there was nothing wrong with Solaris, but
they weren't advancing it.
That's not their direction of travel. And they said, well, we're going to sunset that product. So there's those sort of things happening. If you want to take advantage of new technology as well, you're going to have to take advantage of it. You're maybe going to have to rebuild systems. That means phasing out old systems, and then you've got to get into the whole process of data migration. But if you're doing all of that work, you should also be looking at process change. And digital transformation has two words, and everybody focuses on the first
digital,
one.
I know.
Okay, transformation is how can we transform the business process? Digital will enable it, or should enable it. So can we take an existing process and actually transform that, make it different?
Make it serve better.
Simplify it, make it serve better, make it more efficient, make it less costly, make it easier to maintain. Maybe that implies, bringing in maybe new technologies, fundamentally changing the way it operates, and change management and training and all those other things that are outside of the pure IT. That an organisation
outside of day-to-day operations.
Yeah, that organisations have to commit to. Like IT doesn't solve your problems on its own. It's a three-legged stool: people, process, technology, and they all have to be in harmony. And find the IT can drive a lot and say, look, this is possible, but the other pieces have to come along as well, and they have to see the benefit.
Isn't there a budget, though, a commitment if you're going to do that? Because if you're replacing a system, you have to allow for that. If you're going to have to do change management, you're going to have to allow. You may have to free people up to do different kinds of work. Do you see that happening?
It becomes a problem when your schedule is full. And we're having these discussions inside at the moment, because if we have a very full schedule, or we have a very full schedule, and you say, well, okay, we can build it, we can build these new things on the existing foundations and architecture. But now all we're doing is just kicking the can down the road. What we need to be doing is looking at some of these. So, for example, that modernisation, we'll be looking at architecting that in a completely new way and moving it off the existing system, so that will help us maybe sunset or retire some of those technologies. Because as technologies get older, they become more difficult to support. I mentioned COBOL. No college in this country teaches COBOL.
No, you just have to go and ask. I think it's, I don't know if you know Pauline Tracy, who's the assistant head of ICT in Dublin City Council, but she was a very expert COBOL programmer. So we get her back in.
We're fortunate. We still have a couple of COBOL programmers, expert COBOL programmers ourselves. But at some point we're going to have to move off COBOL. Now, we still have many million lines of COBOL code. It works perfectly well. There's lots of corporate knowledge embedded in those systems. At some point, we're going to have to say, well, how do we move that forward to a more supportable technology? Or do we go a different tact and say, well, actually, we're now going to train people to maintain this?
So, would you recommend somebody who wants to have an exciting career to join Revenue? I mean, on your experience.
Oh, absolutely. I think Revenue is a fantastic place to work. There's great opportunities. The work is very diverse. Obviously, in IT, we get to see the broad range of revenue work. People who work in a tax office are maybe focused on, particular taxes, or in customs or in particular customs work. But even at that, it's really interesting work, and there's great opportunities for people to, get on and do well if they're committed. Great opportunities for additional learning, and we'll support people for courses and training, and There's a huge opportunities for people, and I think Revenue is a great place to work. And as I said at the outset, it's a really important job. And I often say to my own crew, it's fun. The work should be.
Is that a threat?
No. The work should be fun.
No, it is.
It's interesting, and you can have a great career getting involved in it. You can have a little bit of fun along the way, because that's important.
And
people work better if they enjoy it.
Yeah.
And I think with a good team, you can have a really interesting time. And I certainly recommend it. Mind you, my own son hasn't
jumped in the back.
My sons haven't jumped at it, but no, they've gone off on other routes. But no, that's fine. You know, I've certainly enjoyed my time in revenue, and I think it's got a lot to offer. It's a great team there. The IT is really good. We've lots of different technologies. I remember doing one of the milk rounds in Trinity many years ago, and we had a very small, low-tech presentation, a PowerPoint.
Yes.
Where there were other vendors or other people trying to attract IT graduates, and they had glitzy videos and all sorts of stuff. But it was interesting. Some of the students came up afterwards and said they were really interested in our one because we were talking about tech. And IT graduates, a lot of them, that's what they're interested in. And we were talking about we're using this technology and we're doing this with that technology. So from a technology perspective, there's great opportunities if people want to get involved. And, you know, I'd certainly encourage anyone who's interested in IT to consider it. And consider IT in the public service, because, you know, it's often forgotten. People don't realise, like, I've probably one of the biggest IT departments in the country, yet people wouldn't even think about revenue having an IT department.
Well, maybe after this interview.
Hopefully.
Well, look, it's been really, really interesting, and thank you so much for making time to come in. It's been fascinating, John, so thank you so much.
No problem. Happy to do it.
And hopefully we might drag you back some other time when there's more things to talk about, which I know there will be.
There's always
new things
to talk
happening.
about. Yeah,
there's always
absolutely.
Yeah. So before we sign off, I'd like to thank the wonderful Transform Gov team as well as John. So that's the producer, Conal Moran, our studio manager, Peter Rice, our video editor, Neil Horner, our sound engineer and videographer, Lee Brennan, and finally thanks to South Dublin Podcast Studios. And John, thank you.
Thank you very much.